You're coming with me.
"You're coming with me," declared the weathered rancher to the trembling black woman clutching twin babies, her face bearing fresh bruises from delivering daughters instead of sons. The frontier community sees her as damaged goods. A failed mail-order bride who couldn't produce the mail heirs her contract promised. They whisper she'll face abandonment or worse, another broken soul destined for servitude in a territory where her kind holds no value. But the mysterious rancher studies her with calculating eyes, recognizing something others miss entirely. His offer of escape carries weight beyond mere charity, though his true motives remain buried beneath layers of careful deception. What he knows about corruption in these lands could either liberate them both or destroy everything they touch. Will trusting this stranger lead to her salvation or seal her doom forever? The stagecoach wheels ground to a halt outside the Cummings estate, kicking up clouds of Colorado dust that settled on everything like a curse. Ruthie Mayfield stepped down carefully, her body still aching from childbirth just weeks before. Twin bundles wrapped in threadbare blankets squirmed against her chest. Hope and Grace, she had named them in whispered prayers during the lonely journey west. The mansion loomed before her, all weathered wood and peeling paint that spoke of faded grandeur. This was supposed to be her new home, her sanctuary, the place where she would finally belong to someone who wanted her. Margaret Cummings emerged from the front door like a storm cloud taking human form. Her gray hair was pulled back so tightly, it stretched the skin around her eyes into permanent slits of disapproval. She descended the porch steps with the measured gait of a woman accustomed to being obeyed. Her gaze swept over Ruthie with the clinical assessment of a cattle buyer inspecting inferior stock. When her eyes landed on the twin babies, her face twisted into undisguised disgust. The words came sharp and cutting. "Girls. You brought me girls." Ruthie's stomach dropped. She had feared this moment during every mile of the journey west. "Yes, ma'am, healthy baby girls." Margaret circled her like a predator. The contract specified male heirs, sons to carry on the family name and work the land. What use are daughters? Behind Margaret, a thin man appeared in the doorway. Harold Cummings possessed all the backbone of wet paper. His weak chin trembled as he approached, clearly dreading his mother's reaction more than meeting his intended bride. "Mother, perhaps we should discuss this inside." Margaret's voice cracked like a whip. "There's nothing to discuss. This woman has failed her most basic obligation." Ruthie clutched her babies tighter. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she had nowhere to go. No money, no family, no options beyond this crumbling estate and the people who already despised her. "I can work," she said quietly. "I can earn my place here." Margaret's laugh held no warmth. "Work? You think manual labor makes up for your failure? Girls are nothing but mouths to feed until they become someone else's burden." Harold finally found enough courage to step forward. His hand moved faster than his brain, striking Ruthie across the cheek with a sound that echoed off the porch walls. The baby started crying. "You will not speak unless spoken to," he said, his voice shaking almost as much as his hand. "You will remember your place in this house." Ruthie's cheek burned, but she refused to let tears fall. She had survived worse than this. Much worse. These people held power over her circumstances, but they could not touch the fierce love she carried for her daughters or the stubborn spark of dignity that no amount of cruelty could extinguish. Margaret gestured toward the back of the house. "Take her to the servants' quarters. She can work in the kitchens and stables until she proves some small measure of worth." The next weeks blurred together in a haze of endless labor and constant criticism. Ruthie scrubbed floors, hauled water, and tended animals while caring for two infants. The other servants, all of them white and eager to maintain their slight elevation above her in the household hierarchy, offered no sympathy or assistance. She slept on a thin mattress in a room barely large enough for a bed. Her baby's cries echoed off bare walls at all hours, earning sharp reprimands from anyone within earshot. Food came in portions smaller than what was given to the dogs. But in quiet moments when she thought no one was watching, Ruthie would study the papers scattered across Harold's desk. Legal documents, contracts, property deeds. The words came easily to her, a skill she had hidden carefully since childhood. She noticed inconsistencies in some of the documents, alterations that seemed deliberate. One afternoon, a stranger arrived at the estate. He rode a tired horse and wore clothes that had seen too many miles of dusty road. Jedediah Sawyer moved with the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing left to prove to anyone. His weathered face suggested he had seen enough of the world to understand its darker corners. Margaret greeted him with the forced politeness reserved for potential hired help. "We might have worked for an experienced ranch hand." Jedediah's eyes missed nothing as he surveyed the estate. His gaze lingered on Ruthie as she hung laundry behind the house, noting the careful way she moved and the protective stance she maintained around her children. He accepted work mucking stables and mending fences. But unlike the other servants, he watched everything with the keen attention of someone gathering information rather than simply earning wages. The breaking point came during one of Margaret's social gatherings. Ruthie was serving tea to a collection of local wives when Hope began crying in the kitchen. The sound carried into the parlor, interrupting Margaret's story about her son's business prospects. Margaret's face flushed red. She stormed into the kitchen and grabbed Ruthie by the arm, dragging her into the parlor before the assembled guests. "This is what passes for help these days," she announced. "Cannot even control her own offspring long enough to serve proper refreshments." The women in the parlor stared with a mixture of amusement and disdain. Ruthie stood frozen, holding Grace while Hope continued crying in the kitchen. Every face in the room looked at her as though she were an exotic animal performing for their entertainment. That was when Jedediah appeared in the parlor doorway. Something in his bearing had changed. The humble ranch hand was gone, replaced by a man who commanded attention simply by existing in a space. His voice carried absolute authority. "You're coming with me." The parlor fell silent except for the ticking of Margaret's grandfather clock. Every woman in the room stared at the rough-dressed stranger who had just issued a command rather than a request. Ruthie clutched Grace tighter, uncertain whether this man represented salvation or a different kind of danger. Margaret's face twisted with indignation. "How dare you enter my home uninvited and make demands?" Jedediah stepped fully into the room, his boots echoing on the polished wooden floor. The transformation in his posture was remarkable. Gone was the subservient ranch hand seeking work. This man radiated quiet authority that seemed to fill every corner of the space. "The contract is void," he said simply. Harold pushed forward, waving a sheaf of papers. "This woman is bound by legal agreement. She owes service to this family until her debt is satisfied." Margaret rallied her courage, emboldened by having witnesses to her authority. "Remove yourself from my property immediately, or I'll have you arrested for trespassing and attempted theft." Jedediah's expression never changed. He reached into his worn coat and withdrew a leather folder. From it he pulled documents that bore official seals and signatures. The paper was crisp and clean, unlike anything a drifting ranch hand should possess. "Circuit Judge Jedediah Sawyer," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of legal authority. "I've been investigating reports of fraudulent mail-order contracts and systematic abuse in this territory." The blood drained from Margaret's face. Harold's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. The assembled ladies whispered among themselves, suddenly aware they were witnessing something far more significant than afternoon gossip. Ruthie felt the world shift beneath her feet. This man was not what he appeared. Nothing about her situation was what it seemed. Jedediah continued speaking, his tone measured and professional. "I've documented multiple violations of territorial contract law. Physical abuse voids any marriage agreement. Failure to provide agreed-upon living conditions. Breach of basic human dignity clauses." Margaret found her voice, though it trembled with barely controlled rage. You cannot simply waltz into my home and steal my property based on some technicality. Property, Jedediah's voice sharpened for the first time. This woman is not property. She is a person with legal rights that have been systematically violated. Harold waved the contract desperately. The agreement clearly states her obligations. She has failed to fulfill the terms by producing male heirs. Ruthie surprised herself by speaking up. Her voice was quiet but clear in the tense room. That contract contains several legal inconsistencies. Every head turned toward her. Margaret's eyes blazed with fury that a servant would dare speak in such company. But Jedediah leaned forward with interest, recognizing something the others had missed entirely. "Explain," he said. Ruthie's heart pounded, but she had nothing left to lose. The jurisdiction clause references territorial statutes that don't exist. The signature dates precede the document date by 2 weeks. The witness signatures appear to be in the same handwriting. The room erupted in murmurs. Harold examined the papers with growing panic, as if seeing them clearly for the first time. Margaret's face went white with something beyond anger, something closer to fear. Jedediah studied Ruthie with new appreciation. "You can read legal documents." "Yes, sir. I was educated before the war." The words came out stronger than she felt. "I learned from books borrowed from the master's daughter. She taught me in secret, including Latin legal terms and contract interpretation." Margaret stepped forward, her voice dripping with condescension. "Even if this girl can read a few words, that doesn't invalidate a legally binding agreement." Jedediah turned back to Harold. "Show me the witness signatures." Harold's hands shook as he held up the contract. Under scrutiny, the flaws became obvious. The ink colors didn't match. The handwriting showed identical characteristics across supposedly different signers. The dates revealed impossible timelines. "This contract is fraudulent," Jedediah declared. "Any agreement based on forged documentation is null and void under territorial law." Ruthie felt something crack open inside her chest. Not just relief, but a dawning understanding that her intelligence had value, that her careful observations mattered, that she possessed skills these people had never bothered to notice or respect. Margaret made one last desperate attempt at control. "You cannot prove these allegations in court. My family has standing in this community." Jedediah's smile held no warmth. "I am the court in this territory, Mrs. Cummings. My jurisdiction extends over all civil and criminal matters, including fraud." He turned to Ruthie, his expression softening. "I'm offering you employment as a court clerk. The position includes housing and salary sufficient to support yourself and your children." The offer hung in the air like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm. Employment. Not servitude or charity, but actual work that utilized her mind rather than just her hands. A chance to earn dignity through her own capabilities. Ruthie straightened her shoulders. "I accept." Margaret's control finally snapped. "This territory will not tolerate your kind in positions of authority. Mark my words, Judge Sawyer. You're making enemies of people who have power to destroy you." Jedediah gathered his papers calmly. "Let them try, Mrs. Cummings. Justice doesn't require their approval." As Ruthie collected her few possessions and her babies, she felt the eyes of the parlor ladies following her movement. Some showed disgust and outrage, but others displayed something different: curiosity, perhaps even admiration for the quiet dignity with which she had dismantled her own chains. Outside, a newspaper man had appeared with notepad and pencil. Eli Torland introduced himself as editor of the local paper, clearly fascinated by the unprecedented scene he had witnessed. Jedediah helped Ruthie into his wagon while her babies slept peacefully in her arms. For the first time in months, they were truly safe. The future stretched ahead, uncertain but filled with possibility. The modest house Jedediah provided sat on the edge of town, close enough to the courthouse for work but far enough from the main street to avoid constant scrutiny. Ruthie spent her first morning arranging the sparse furniture and marveling at the luxury of a roof that didn't leak and walls that belonged to no one but herself. Her babies cooed from makeshift cribs fashioned from wooden crates lined with soft cloth. For the first time since their birth, Hope and Grace seemed to sense safety in their surroundings. They slept peacefully while their mother explored her new role. The courthouse occupied a weathered building that had seen better decades. Inside, legal documents covered every available surface in organized chaos that spoke of too much work and too few hands. Jedediah showed her the filing system, the case logs, and the mountain of correspondence that required attention. Ruthie's mind absorbed the information like parched earth soaking up rain. The legal terminology came naturally, building on the foundation she had constructed through stolen moments with borrowed books. Within days, she was reorganizing files with an efficiency that impressed even Jedediah. But the town's reaction proved less welcoming. The general store owner served her last, after every white customer had been helped. The church congregation fell silent when she entered with her babies, creating a wall of cold disapproval that made worship impossible. Children threw rocks at her house while their parents pretended not to notice. Anonymous notes appeared under her door with increasing frequency. The messages were brief and threatening, warning her to leave town before something terrible happened. She burned each one without mentioning them to Jedediah, unwilling to become a burden when he had already risked so much on her behalf. The first major test came when Tom Walking Bear brought his family's case to court. The Cheyenne man spoke broken English, but his eyes held the intelligence of someone who understood far more than he could easily express. His family had been living peacefully on a small plot of land for 3 generations, but wealthy rancher Samuel Morrison claimed ownership and demanded their removal. Ruthie spent hours researching territorial treaties and land grant records, while Jedediah prepared for the hearing. The legal precedents were complex, involving federal jurisdiction, territorial authority, and tribal rights that often contradicted each other depending on which government official had signed which document in which year. As she studied, memories surfaced of midnight lessons in the plantation library. The master's daughter, Emily, had been barely older than Ruthie but possessed a passion for learning that transcended social boundaries. She had taught Ruthie not just to read, but to think critically about what she read, to question inconsistencies and follow logical threads to their conclusions. Those skills served her well now as she uncovered a crucial discrepancy in Morrison's land claims. The original survey markers described in his deed didn't match the current boundaries he was claiming. Someone had altered the legal description after the fact, expanding his holdings to include the Walking Bear family's traditional grounds. The courtroom filled with tension on the day of the hearing. Morrison arrived with expensive lawyers and a collection of supporters who made their opinions clear through hostile stares and whispered comments. Tom Walking Bear sat quietly with his wife and elderly father, their dignity intact despite the circumstances. Political pressure mounted before the hearing even began. Territorial officials had sent word that Morrison's cattle operation provided significant tax, revenue, and employment. They strongly suggested that disrupting his business interests would not be viewed favorably by the territorial government. Jedediah called the court to session, his expression revealing nothing of the pressure he faced. Morrison's lawyers presented their case with polished confidence, citing property deeds and survey records that appeared to support their client's claims. But when Jedediah called for opposing evidence, something unprecedented happened. He nodded toward Ruthie, who rose from her clerk's desk with a folder of meticulously organized documents. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. A woman presenting legal arguments was unusual enough. A black woman doing so crossed every social boundary the community recognized. Ruthie's voice carried clearly through the sudden silence. She began by outlining the original treaty obligations, then methodically demonstrated how Morrison's current claims exceeded the boundaries described in his own property deed. Her argument built systematically, piece by piece, until the altered survey descriptions became impossible to ignore. Morrison's lawyers objected repeatedly, But their protests sounded increasingly desperate as Ruthie continued her presentation. She had memorized every relevant statute and could cite territorial law with the precision of someone who had earned her knowledge through necessity rather than privilege. The culminating evidence came in the form of the original survey notes, which Ruthie had located in archived territorial records. The handwriting clearly showed alterations made years after the initial documentation, expanding Morrison's legal description to include land that had never been part of his original grant. When she finished, the courtroom sat in stunned silence. Even Morrison's supporters seemed unsure how to respond to such methodical demolition of their case. Jedediah ruled in favor of the Walking Bear family, ordering Morrison to respect the original boundary markers and cease his expansion efforts. The decision sent ripples through the community that would have consequences far beyond a single land dispute. That evening, as Ruthie fed her babies and reflected on the day's victory, she found herself thinking about Emily and those midnight lessons. Her former teacher had always insisted that knowledge belonged to anyone brave enough to pursue it. Today, that stolen education had served justice in ways Emily never could have imagined. But celebration mixed with apprehension as more threatening notes appeared under her door. The community's resistance was hardening into something more dangerous than social disapproval. Change always came with a price, and Ruthie sensed she had only begun to pay it. Word of the Walking Bear verdict spread through the territory like wildfire. Within days, Margaret Cummings had organized a petition demanding Jedediah's removal from the bench. She moved through the community with the focused determination of someone whose world order had been fundamentally challenged. The petition gathered signatures faster than Ruthie had expected. Shopkeepers, ranchers, and church leaders all added their names to the document calling for a return to proper social boundaries. They cited concerns about judicial overreach and the dangerous precedent of allowing unqualified individuals to influence legal proceedings. But something unexpected happened alongside the organized resistance. Tom Walking Bear's elderly father appeared at the courthouse with a basket of fresh vegetables from their family garden. He spoke no English, but his weathered hands pressed the gift into Ruthie's arms with unmistakable gratitude. A Mexican family whose water rights had been restored in a previous case brought hand-sewn baby clothes for hope and grace. The Chinese miners from the disputed claim near Willow Creek contributed coins from their meager earnings to help with household expenses. Eli Torland documented these gestures in his newspaper, creating a narrative that contrasted sharply with the official petitions circulating through town. His articles portrayed Ruthie not as an unqualified interloper, but as someone whose unique perspective had brought justice to people who had never expected to receive it. The romantic tension between Ruthie and Jedediah developed naturally through their shared work. Late evenings spent reviewing cases revealed depths to both their characters that daylight formality had hidden. Jedediah spoke of his guilt over past judicial decisions that had favored wealth over justice. Ruthie shared her dreams of creating a world where her daughters could pursue education without hiding their intelligence. Their relationship built on mutual respect rather than desperation or convenience. Each recognized in the other a kindred spirit committed to using their abilities in service of something larger than personal advancement. But the political pressure continued mounting. Territorial officials sent increasingly urgent messages warning Jedediah about the complaints flooding their offices. His unorthodox methods and controversial clerk were generating attention from federal authorities who preferred their frontier territories to operate quietly and predictably. Eli Torland's investigation into document irregularities began yielding disturbing patterns. Multiple land disputes across the territory showed similar characteristics to the Morrison case. Survey boundaries had been altered. Witness signatures appeared suspiciously similar across different transactions. Dates and legal references contained the same types of inconsistencies Ruthie had identified in her own fraudulent marriage contract. The scope of potential corruption extended far beyond individual cases of greed or incompetence. Someone with extensive knowledge of territorial law had been systematically manipulating legal documents to transfer land ownership from vulnerable populations to a connected network of wealthy settlers. Late one evening, as Ruthie organized files by lamplight while her babies slept, she noticed something that made her hands freeze over the paperwork. Margaret Cummings' name appeared as a witness on dozens of property transfers spanning the past 5 years. Her signature showed up on documents filed in counties where she had no obvious business or family connections. Even more troubling, Margaret's witness signatures showed remarkable consistency across years and different locations. Most people's handwriting evolved over time, showing slight variations based on circumstances, health, and age. But Margaret's signatures looked almost identical across a span that should have shown natural changes. The break-in happened 3 nights later. Ruthie woke to the sound of papers scattering in the courthouse next door. She peered through her window to see shadowy figures moving by lamplight through the building where she worked. By morning, specific case files had disappeared. Not entire cabinets or random documents, but particular cases involving land disputes, witness testimony, and the archived records that had proven so damaging to fraudulent claims. The theft was surgical in its precision, suggesting intimate knowledge of which documents posed the greatest threat. Jedediah's jaw tightened as he surveyed the damage. The missing files represented months of meticulous documentation and research. More importantly, they contained evidence that could expose the true scope of the corruption network operating throughout the territory. Margaret Cummings visited the courthouse that same afternoon, her demeanor radiating cold satisfaction. She inquired about the break-in with false concern, asking whether any important documents had been damaged or destroyed. Her questions revealed knowledge about the filing system that no ordinary citizen should possess. The threats escalated beyond anonymous notes. Ruthie found dead animals on her doorstep. Windows in her house developed mysterious cracks during the night. Her baby's crying was interrupted by sounds of footsteps circling the building at all hours. Yet support also materialized from unexpected sources. The blacksmith's wife began leaving fresh bread by Ruthie's door. Several church members quietly expressed admiration for her courage and intelligence, even as their congregation officially shunned her presence. Eli Torland's newspaper articles grew bolder, directly challenging the petition efforts and questioning the motives behind the organized campaign against judicial reform. His editorials painted Ruthie as a symbol of frontier justice overcoming entrenched corruption. The federal investigators arrived quietly, conducting interviews and examining records without fanfare or advance warning. Their presence confirmed that the territorial corruption had attracted attention from Washington, where officials preferred their western territories to avoid scandalous headlines. Margaret's network began showing signs of strain as increased scrutiny made their usual operations more difficult and dangerous. But cornered animals often proved most vicious, and Ruthie sensed that the real confrontation lay ahead. The evidence was building towards something that would either expose the truth completely or destroy everyone brave enough to seek it. The federal investigators worked with quiet efficiency, their presence creating ripples of anxiety throughout the community. Agent William Cross and his partner, Agent Sarah Mitchell, had traveled from Denver with authority that superseded territorial jurisdiction. They interviewed witnesses, examined documents, and asked pointed questions that made comfortable people very uncomfortable. Ruthie found herself at the center of their investigation. Her analytical abilities and intimate knowledge of the corrupted documents made her an invaluable resource. She spent hours walking the agents through the patterns she had identified, demonstrating how seemingly unrelated cases connected through forged signatures and altered legal descriptions. Agent Cross studied her work with growing amazement. "You've documented a conspiracy spanning 5 counties and dozens of fraudulent transactions. This level of systematic analysis would challenge experienced federal prosecutors. The praise felt foreign but welcome. Ruthie had spent so much of her life hiding her intelligence that having it recognized and valued by people with real authority seemed almost surreal. She continued mapping connections between cases, creating a visual representation of corruption that stretched across the entire territory. Eli Torland's newspaper became increasingly bold in its coverage. His latest article directly accused unnamed territorial officials of participating in widespread land fraud. The piece featured interviews with victims across multiple counties, creating a chorus of voices demanding justice. But the network struck back swiftly. Eli's printing press was vandalized beyond repair, metal type scattered and machinery damaged with methodical precision. The message was clear: silence or face escalating consequences. Margaret Cummings made a strategic error by visiting Eli personally the day after the vandalism. She offered to fund a replacement printing press if he would focus his journalistic efforts on more positive community stories. Her generosity came with obvious strings attached that revealed her desperation to control the narrative. Eli declined politely, but documented the encounter meticulously. Margaret's attempt at bribery provided another piece of evidence linking her directly to efforts to suppress the investigation. The second revelation came when Ruthie discovered correspondence between Margaret and territorial officials in Pierre. The letters, hidden in archived courthouse files, revealed a sophisticated network of communication that coordinated land acquisitions across vast distances. Margaret's letters demonstrated extensive knowledge of legal procedures, territorial statutes, and administrative processes that far exceeded what any rancher's wife should possess. She wrote with the authority of someone accustomed to giving orders rather than requesting favors. More damning still, the letters referenced specific legal strategies for displacing Native American families, Mexican settlers, and freed slaves who held legitimate land claims. The correspondence outlined methods for creating fraudulent documentation that would withstand casual scrutiny, while transferring valuable property to network members. Agent Mitchell focused her investigation on the financial aspects of the conspiracy. Bank records revealed a complex system of payments flowing between Margaret's associates and various territorial officials. Land purchased for minimal amounts from displaced families was immediately resold to network members at dramatically inflated prices. The profits were staggering. Hundreds of thousands of dollars had changed hands through fraudulent transactions, creating wealth for a small group of conspirators while impoverishing the legitimate landowners they had displaced. Jedediah's situation grew increasingly precarious as pressure mounted from multiple directions. Territorial Governor Marcus Thornfield demanded his immediate resignation, citing concerns about his controversial methods and the federal attention his jurisdiction was attracting. But resignation would abandon the investigation at its most crucial moment. Jedediah chose to remain in his position, using his judicial authority to protect the federal agents and ensure their access to necessary documents and witnesses. The conspiracy's response was swift and calculated. False charges were filed against Jedediah, alleging corruption, abuse of authority, and inappropriate conduct with his clerk. The accusations were designed to destroy his credibility while removing him from his position of power. Local law enforcement, compromised by years of corruption, moved to arrest Jedediah on the fabricated charges. Sheriff Coleman arrived at the courthouse with a warrant signed by a territorial judge who had been purchased long ago by Margaret's network. Ruthie watched from her office window as they led Jedediah away in shackles. Her heart pounded with fear and rage, but her mind remained focused on the larger battle still to be fought. The federal agents had gathered substantial evidence, but presenting it effectively would require someone with intimate knowledge of every document and connection. That evening, Agent Cross visited Ruthie at her home. His expression was grave as he outlined the situation they faced. With Jedediah detained, The conspiracy believed they had neutralized the primary threat to their operations. "We need someone who can present this evidence coherently to a federal tribunal," he said. "Someone who understands every aspect of the fraud and can explain the connections convincingly." Ruthie understood what he was asking. The responsibility terrified and exhilarated her simultaneously. This was the moment everything had been building toward. All her stolen education, hidden intelligence, and carefully developed legal skills would be tested in service of justice on a scale she had never imagined. Her babies slept peacefully in their cribs, unaware that their mother was preparing to challenge an entire corrupt system. Hope and Grace would grow up in whatever world emerged from the coming confrontation. That knowledge gave Ruthie the courage she needed. She accepted the responsibility, knowing that failure would mean not just personal destruction, but the continuation of systematic oppression for countless others who lacked the power to fight for themselves. The final battle would be fought with words, evidence, and moral authority rather than weapons. Everything depended on her ability to stand before powerful people and demand justice with nothing but truth as her weapon. The federal tribunal convened in the largest courtroom Denver could provide. Word had spread throughout the territory that unprecedented charges would be brought against some of the region's most powerful citizens. Spectators packed every available seat while others stood along the walls, creating an atmosphere of electric tension. Ruthie entered the courtroom carrying a leather satchel containing months of meticulous documentation. Her simple dress contrasted sharply with the expensive suits worn by the defense attorneys, who represented Margaret Cummings and her co-conspirators. She walked to the witness table with quiet dignity, her spine straight despite the weight of hostile stares. Federal Judge Harrison presided over the proceedings with the stern authority of someone accustomed to cases involving territorial corruption. Agent Cross had briefed him thoroughly on the scope of the conspiracy, but the burden of proof rested on the evidence Ruthie would present. Margaret sat at the defense table surrounded by the finest legal representation money could buy. Her face showed no trace of the fear that must have been consuming her thoughts. She had built her empire through careful calculation and ruthless execution, believing herself untouchable by federal authority. Ruthie began her presentation with the original fraudulent marriage contract that had brought her to the Cummings estate. She explained each alteration, each forged signature, each impossible date sequence that revealed the document's true nature. The courtroom listened in absolute silence as she demonstrated how this single contract represented a pattern replicated dozens of times across the territory. Her voice grew stronger as she moved through the evidence systematically. The stolen education that had once been her secret weapon now served justice openly. Every midnight lesson with Emily, every hidden book, every careful observation had prepared her for this moment. The land fraud cases formed the centerpiece of her presentation. Using maps and survey records, she showed how legitimate landowners had been systematically dispossessed through forged documentation. Native American families, Mexican settlers, freed slaves, and poor white farmers had all lost their property to the same network of conspirators. Margaret's defense attorneys objected repeatedly, challenging Ruthie's qualifications to interpret legal documents. But federal Judge Harrison overruled each objection, recognizing that her analysis was thorough, logical, and devastating to the defense case. The financial evidence proved equally damning. Bank records revealed the flow of money between conspirators, showing how stolen land had been converted into enormous profits for a select group of territorial elite. The amounts were staggering, representing the life savings and legitimate inheritance of hundreds of displaced families. As Ruthie presented the correspondence between Margaret and territorial officials, the true scope of the conspiracy became clear. This was not opportunistic individual fraud, but a coordinated effort to reshape territorial land ownership through systematic corruption. Margaret's letters were read aloud in her own words, revealing the calculating mind behind years of carefully orchestrated theft. Her instructions to subordinates showed intimate knowledge of legal procedures and bureaucratic processes that exposed her as the conspiracy's mastermind. The defense attempted to portray Margaret as a victim of circumstances, manipulated by more sophisticated criminals who had used her social connections for their own purposes. But the evidence spoke too clearly of her central role in planning and executing the fraudulent schemes. When Ruthie concluded her presentation, the courtroom remained silent for several long moments. Even the defense attorneys seemed stunned by the comprehensive nature of the case she had built through months of careful analysis and documentation. Federal Judge Harrison rendered his verdict with swift efficiency. Margaret Cummings and 17 co-conspirators were found guilty of federal fraud charges carrying substantial prison sentences. Their assets would be seized to provide restitution for their victims. More importantly for the territory's future, the ruling established legal precedents that protected minority land rights and required enhanced documentation standards for property transfers. The systematic oppression that had operated through corrupted legal channels would no longer be possible. Jedediah's false charges were dismissed immediately, and he returned to his judicial position with expanded federal support for his reform efforts. The territorial officials who had participated in the conspiracy faced their own federal charges and removal from office. In the months that followed, stolen lands were restored to their rightful owners across the territory. Tom Walking Bear's family recovered not just their original plot, but additional property that had been fraudulently transferred years earlier. Mexican families regained water rights that had been systematically denied through forged documentation. Ruthie accepted an official appointment as the territory's first legal advocate for minority affairs, a position created specifically to prevent future systematic oppression. Her salary provided financial security while her work offered the intellectual challenges she had always craved. The wedding ceremony was held in the same courtroom where justice had been served. Jedediah and Ruthie exchanged vows before a gathering that included everyone whose lives had been touched by their courage. Tom Walking Bear's family sat beside Chinese miners and Mexican settlers, creating a community built on shared respect rather than artificial hierarchy. Hope and Grace grew up in a house filled with books and legal documents, their mother's story becoming their inspiration. Ruthie established a school for girls of all backgrounds, ensuring that education would never again be a privilege restricted by race or social position. Years later, when her daughters asked about her journey from servitude to respect, Ruthie would point to the law books lining their shelves and remind them that knowledge belonged to anyone brave enough to pursue it. Justice required not just good intentions, but the intelligence and determination to fight for it systematically. The territory that had once been ruled by corruption and prejudice became a model for frontier justice, proving that ordinary people could create extraordinary change when they refused to accept systematic oppression as inevitable. And that is all to the story for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story there. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel, and if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.